New Corner by L T C Rolt. The Blighs were late as usual, and practice day was nearly over when their familiar old Vauxhall with its loaded trailer rumbled into the paddock. It was the first meeting of the 1938 season at the famous Highbury Hill, and promised to be the best of a long series, for the enthusiastic organisers, the Mercia Motor Club, had been preparing for the event as never before. Not only had they managed to secure an international date for the first time, but they had improved the hill out of all recognition, widening, resurfacing and constructing one entirely new section of road. These efforts had been justly rewarded by what was probably the finest entry list that a speed hill climb in this country had ever produced. Germany had sent over one of her Grand Prix Rheinwagens, a 3-litre 16-cylinder rear-engine job to be handled by no less a person than von Eberstraum himself. France had entered her most successful driver, Camille, with a Monsieur René Lefebvre's latest masterpiece, a double-cam straight-eight of conventional design, somewhat untried, but a joy to the eye, like all René's cars. Most noteworthy of all, Italy was to be represented by her veteran maestro Emilio Volanti, driving a marque which had not been associated with his name for some time, a 3-litre Maserati, the first Italian car seriously to challenge German speed supremacy. The British reply to this formidable continental opposition was provided by the works team of BRCs and a host of sprint specials. The former were smaller than their continental rivals, but the course suited them, and, with the exception of the new section, their drivers had the advantage of knowing the hill intimately. The specials were, as always, an unknown quantity. Some, on their day, were quite capable of matching the performance of the Grand Prix cars over such a short course, while others might merely provide comic relief by emitting remarkably irregular noises and bestrewing the course with intimate parts of their machinery. There was no doubt about it. The stage was set for a record meeting. No wonder Mr. Nelson, the genial little secretary and moving spirit of the MMC, had felt excited and pleased with himself that morning when he'd watched lorries bearing names famous on all the circuits of Europe come rolling into his paddock. Brothers Peter and John lost no time in unloading the Bligh special from its trailer. "If you go and rout out the scrutineer," said Peter, as they manhandled the special into its bay, "I'll go and talk nicely to Nelson, see if I can't wangle one run before dark." John had barely finished unloading from the tonneau of the Vauxhall the cans of dope, the tools, and all the other paraphernalia that accompanies the sprint car when Peter came back at the double. "It's okay," he called, "but we'll have to hurry. Nelson's sending over the scrutineer. Meanwhile, we've got to go for a walk, blast it. All drivers have to go over the new section on foot and report to the timing box that they've done so before they're allowed to run." He paused, peering round the paddock. "I wonder where those silly asses have got to. I told them to keep a lookout for us," he complained. "Maybe they've got fed up with waiting and gone off to the Crown," John hazarded. "I'll break their silly necks if they have," Peter swore. "No, they're snooping around the Maserati. Oi!" he bellowed. "Mike! George!" Two tall, untidy figures detached themselves from the curious group about the Italian car and came towards them at a jog-trot. "Where the hell have you been?" shouted one as soon as he came within earshot. "We're just giving you up. Thought you must have thrown the trailer away again on the way, so we're just going to make for the local tap-house." "Never mind about that now," Peter silenced him. "Your thirst will improve with keeping. The great thing at the moment is to get a practice run before dark. John and I have to walk over the new bit of the course, so if you'd like to make yourself really useful for a change, you can get her ready and warmed up while we're away. That's the dope can, the one with the white top. It's already mixed. The soft plugs are in, but you'd better have a look at them before you try a start. When she's just about sizzling, put in the R2s there in the yellow box. Oh, and another thing," he added, "the scrutineer is on his way, so none of your rudery, or he may take a poor view of John's idea of independent suspension." "As you say, Chief," Mike replied with mock humility and pulled his forelock. Yet he took his coat off and set to work with a will, ably assisted by the quiet George, while the others set off up the course. Whereas the old road wound its way up through the wood in a series of zigzag curves, thus gaining height on an easy gradient, the new section left the old at the first of these corners and cut straight and steeply up the hillside for a distance of 300 yards to a single left-handed turn. This was followed by another straight on a slightly easier gradient, which ran parallel with the flank of the hill until it rejoined the old course at what had previously been the very slow creek hairpin. Peter and John stood on the apex of the new corner, surveying it with critical and practised eyes. "There's no doubt about it, this is a great improvement," John decided. "It'll make the course much faster and more interesting, too. This swerve reminds me of the first bend of the Essay at Chesley. Same gradient to it, I should think, same curvature and camber. Same bank on the outside, too, for the unwary to clout. Of course, it's difficult to judge just how steep that approach is, so that one can't tell exactly where the cut-off point will be, but I should say it would be just about opposite these stones here." He pointed to two great boulders that stood like monoliths, one on each side of the road. Peter nodded. "I think you're right," he agreed. "It looks straightforward enough, and yet... I don't know. There's something I don't like about it. Exactly what it is, I couldn't tell you." "Phew!" he exclaimed and laughed shortly. "What a stink! Old socks and rotten eggs aren't in it. Something must have died here a long time ago, I should think." "That's funny," said John, sniffing. "I don't notice it. Anyway, we'd better get down. It seems to be getting dark all of a sudden under these trees, so unless we hurry we shan't have enough light for a run." When they got back to the paddock, practically everyone had packed up for the night, but the faithful Mike and his shadow, George, had the special ready, and only awaiting a push to the line. Peter wriggled his way into the narrow bucket seat in front of the two potent V twin engines, and the others pushed. Letting in the clutch, he was greeted with the deafening staccato bark of 4 open exhausts belching blue flame and a reek of dope and castor oil. For a few moments the air about the timing box was filled with an intensity of urgent sound that literally stung the eardrums to painful protest, while Peter tightened his body belt, pulled down his goggles, and exchanged a last shouted word or two with John. Then, at a nodded signal, Mike released the plungers of the 2 oil pumps and stepped back. The note of the engines rose even more fiercely, and the next instant the car was snaking out of sight in a series of power slides, leaving in its wake 2 long, black streaks of pungent burnt rubber from the tyres. "Bit too much loud pedal there," Mike commented. Although invisible to him, John could follow Peter's progress by the noise that now resounded through the wood and echoed above the surrounding hills. Now he had a cutout and changed down for the first corner into the wood, a sharp one that. Now he was round and accelerating away for all he was worth, up the steep straight to the new corner. He was through to the second now, into third. That was a surprise. He'd not expected that Peter would get into third. Now he'd cut out for the new corner. John waited expectantly for a renewed burst of sound, but no sound came. He must have crashed. Then, after what seemed an age of suspense, but must in reality have been but a second or two, he heard the sound of one engine come to life and continue over the top of the hill. John heaved a sigh of relief and walked round to meet the car at the foot of the return road anyway. Peter and the special were still in one piece. Peter came coasting back in a fine fury, consigning with great fluency the MMC, the hill, the local inhabitants, and the new corner to a particularly lurid hell. John gave him a few moments in which to simmer down before he dared to enquire what had happened. "What happened?" Peter exploded with renewed fury. "Well, I was going a treat, as you probably heard, pulling third on the straight too, and just as I came into the new corner, some suicidal idiot came flapping out at me, waving his arms plumb in the middle of the road. It meant that I had to brake and alter course right in the middle of the corner. It was no fault of his that I didn't pile up the whole outfit. As it was, I just touched the bank on the outside, shot across the road, went up on the grass on the inside, and eventually managed to get back onto the road again. By that time, one engine had cut out. Still, I think the car's all right. We'll have to get up bright and early and get in a couple of runs tomorrow morning, that's all. There's not enough light in the wood for another run now." When the Blighs eventually arrived at the Crown in Winchford, where they'd arranged to stay, They found Mr. Nelson leaning on the bar, chatting to Camille and Butt, the number 1 BRC driver. He looked up and smiled as they came in. "Well, how did you get on, Bligh?" he inquired. Peter grinned ruefully. "Oh, all right, thanks, as far as it went, which wasn't very far, I'm afraid." "You're not going to tell me you had trouble on the new corner, are you?" Mr. Nelson implored. "Everyone seems to have been in difficulties there. I've heard nothing but complaints about it all day. The surface, the camber, the light, nothing seems to be right about it. It's pretty disheartening for me after so much work. Even Volanti said he had a nasty moment there, though he put up an excellent time. 3 people have hit the bank, fortunately without serious damage, and several others had their engines die quite unaccountably when they came to open up after the corner." Mr. Nelson looked quite downcast. "Oh, no," Peter hastened to assure him. "I've got no complaint to make against the corner itself, but just as I came into it, some fool popped out from nowhere right in the middle of the road, waving his arms like a lunatic. Result was I had a very busy time indeed. While I was motoring about on the grass and dodging trees, I lost one engine." Poor conscientious Mr. Nelson looked more harassed than ever, and swore under his breath. "I'm most frightfully sorry to hear about this, Bligh," he apologised. "I can't think who could have done such a crazy thing. When you went up, the marshals had just come down and reported to me there were no spectators left on the hill. Only Arthur Day was still up there, hanging in the top timing box until you'd made your run. Tell me, what did this idiot look like?" Peter thought for a moment before replying. "Well," he explained, "the light was pretty poor under the trees by the time I went up, so anyway you can't notice much detail when you're dicing. But he seemed a tall, thin bloke, wearing something white. Looked like an overall coat, or it may have been a very light-coloured mackintosh. The odd thing that struck me, now I come to think of it, was that he didn't seem to have the coat on properly. His arms, through the sleeves I mean, were slung around his shoulders so that it looked like, well, more like a surplice than anything else." He laughed. "I'm not trying to suggest, though, that it may have been the local padre in his war paint, or anything like that. Just as I got the car back onto the road," he went on, "I had a quick look round, but he must have made a lightning getaway, for I couldn't see a sign of him. Anyway," Peter concluded, "I'm not worrying. It was my own fault for turning up so late. What'll you have to drink?" he asked. The conversation became general, and the usual topics that are raised on the eve of a speed event were discussed at length. Talk was of blowers and blower pressures, of gear ratios, suspension and braking systems, and of twin rear wheels versus single. Mr. Nelson played his part nobly in this discussion, for he was secretly a prey to a vague feeling of uneasiness, a dim sense of foreboding, which began to get the upper hand later, when he found himself alone in his room for the night. That confounded new corner seemed to be at the bottom of everything, he reflected. What an unlucky job it had been from start to finish. A constant worry. At one time he'd seriously doubted whether the road would ever be ready in time. They had had such a long chapter of accidents and irritating annoyances. In the first place, the local wiseacres had been even more pig-headed and obstinate than usual, and had not only refused to help the work of the club in any way, but had actually seemed bent on putting obstacles in their path. None of the local contractors could be persuaded to take on the job, and he had been compelled to employ a London firm at much greater expense. All this because of some archaic superstition about a ring of old stones through which the road would pass. To begin with, some foolish practical joker, presumably one of the villagers, kept moving the surveyor's pegs and sights overnight, and once they'd even been collected together and burnt. Next, a large oak tree they were felling, thanks to an unexpected and violent gust of wind, on an otherwise calm day, fell unexpectedly in the wrong direction. It trapped the foreman, seriously injuring him, while several of the men had narrow escapes. The mechanical navvy broke down repeatedly, until finally a subsidence occurred beneath it, and it required days of digging and the erection of shear legs before it could be extricated. Just when the excavations were nearly at an end, and they were preparing to lay the foundations of the road, a spring had been struck, which made the whole hillside a hopeless quagmire of mud. Then the trouble began among the workmen. Several of them fell victims to a peculiar and singularly unpleasant complaint, from which 2 had subsequently died, and the remainder had become restless and uneasy, saying there was no luck on the job. No doubt local talk was responsible. Seeing the work was so behind time, he tried to persuade the contractor to put on a night shift, offering to provide them with flares, but the men had resolutely refused to work after sundown. It was only by the dogged persistence of Mr. Nelson himself that the road had been completed in time for the event, and it was with a sense of personal triumph that he'd opened the course to competitors. When beset by all these difficulties, he'd actually begun to wonder at times whether there might not, after all, be some truth in local superstitions. But when the new road was at last finished, and he toured up it at the wheel of his blue saloon Lefebvre, this disturbing thought had been forgotten. Now the unfortunate mishaps in practice, and particularly Bligh's story, had recalled his past uneasiness. He recollected how he dismissed impatiently the workmen's talk of something or someone flitting about among the trees, never seen in broad daylight, but only after sundown, often glimpsed in the corner of the eye, but never directly seen. Strange, too, that both workmen and drivers had complained of the unpleasant stench that occasionally seemed to hang about the corner. In an attempt to put a stop to these disquieting and unprofitable thoughts, Mr. Nelson decided to indulge in his favourite relaxation of reading in bed. After a while the book slipped from his hands onto the coverlet, and he fell into an uneasy sleep, which brought with it a very vivid and disturbing dream. He was sitting in his favourite position, in the lower timing box at Longbury. It was evidently late in the day, for the light seemed subdued. Through the window he could see the Rheinwagen on the starting line, with von Eberstraum at the wheel. For no apparent reason, this perfectly normal spectacle seemed to inspire him with dreadful uneasiness. He felt as though he was the unwilling witness of some sinister sequence of events which he was quite powerless to interrupt. He saw the starter place the contact shoe before the front wheel of the car, and as he did so a voice said, quite clearly and distinctly, "He's out for blood." Then the Rheinwagen made its anticipated meteoric getaway. Mr. Nelson realized that he had the headphones on and listened anxiously for the reassuring voice of Arthur Day to announce the time. It did not come. Instead, his head became filled with a distant but penetrating reverberation of sound. It was like nothing he'd ever heard before, but it most closely resembled the far-off booming of a great gong. Then a thin, high voice began to intone in a tongue that was unintelligible and yet somehow indescribably menacing. Finally, and seemingly much nearer at hand, someone screamed. At this point Mr. Nelson awoke, with the scream still ringing in his ears, to find himself bathed in perspiration, despite the fact that he'd kicked most of the bedclothes onto the floor. Disinclined to court further sleep that night, and feeling wretchedly ill at ease, he propped himself upright with his pillows and resigned himself to read his novel with as much concentration as he could muster for the rest of the night. A brilliant spring morning without a cloud in the sky did much to dispel Mr. Nelson's gloomy fears and to make amends for his wretched night. He felt inclined to attribute his nightmare to overindulgence in the Crown's excellent Stilton at dinner the previous evening. When he opened the course at noon, accompanied by the president of the club and a minor royalty, he felt in excellent humour once more. A record crowd of spectators thronged the banks and enclosures on the hill, and the fields below were black with cars. In the interval between the first and second runs, Mr. Nelson felt justified in laughing at his forebodings, for the unfortunate incidents of practice day had not reoccurred, and the programme had been run off like clockwork. It was obvious that the honour of fastest time of the day lay between von Eberstraum and Volanti with the Macerati. Von Eberstraum, it appeared, had a slightly faster car, but he held an advantage of a mere fifth of a second over Volanti, who was handling his car with that almost fabulous skill for which he was justly famous. A brilliantly judged climb by Butt in No. 1 BRC won him first place in the 1.5 litre class and third in the general classification, while the Bligh Special had made an ear-splitting run to record the fastest time by a sprint special. The performance of the new Lefebvre was a little disappointing, and Camille could only manage 5th place. Mr. Nelson could see him in the paddock now, explaining volubly and with a wealth of gesture, typically Gallic, to a group of equally vociferous mechanics why the car was quite useless and unfit for him, the great Camille, to drive. It was just as the first car was being brought to the line for its second run that an unfortunate and most unusual mishap occurred to delay the proceedings. Without any warning, a section of the bank above the new corner gave way and slid down into the road, carrying several spectators with it. Fortunately, no one was injured, and amidst much laughter and jesting, a gang of amateur navvies was hastily recruited, and set to work with a will to clear the earth onto the inside of the corner. Even so, the delay caused was such that Mr. Nelson realized that unless the rest of the program was run off extremely promptly, the light would fail the last cars. However, once the obstruction had been cleared, and the spectators moved back as a precautionary measure, the second runs were made amid much excitement, but again without untoward incident. Von Eberstraum and Volanti both made faster, but this time identical times, and sent a message to the timing box requesting that they be allowed an additional run each to decide the tie. This was granted, though the two drivers were urged to come to the line as soon as possible on account of the failing light. The announcement that the tie was about to be run off provoked a murmur of excited anticipation and speculation from the dense crowds on the hill. Volanti appeared first, as the Rheinwagen mechanics were changing rear wheels. As he was pushed to the line, and the engine of the Maturati was started, the sun was just sinking beyond the horizon of the vale, and already the outlines of the woods and of the farther hills were becoming indistinct in a blue evening haze. The maestro went off like a bullet, his hatchet face set in the determined way that meant business. His time came through surprisingly quickly, Arthur Day's usually quiet voice raised with excitement. It was 2/5 of a second better than his previous run. Now von Eberstraum. The silver Rheinwagen was pushed up to the line by the impassive German mechanics. The driver climbed into the cockpit. One mechanic fixed the detachable steering wheel in place, while another inserted the starting handle at the tail. At a signal from the driver, he gave one sharp flick of the wrist, and the engine broke into its characteristic deep-throated roar, little puffs of black smoke spurting vertically upward from 16 short pipes as the throttle was blipped. Von Eberstraum looked grimly determined as he drew on his gloves and adjusted his goggles. A marshal bent towards Mr. Nelson in the timing box. "He's out for blood," he shouted above the roar. Mr. Nelson's heart sank within him, for in a moment he realized that his nightmare of the previous night was being reenacted before his eyes. Every detail was horribly familiar. The particular quality of the light which seemed to have suddenly become dim, a little unimportant gesture which the starter made as he acknowledged the nod from the timing box and placed the contact shoe before the wheel. Once more, a sense of inevitably impending tragedy made him feel powerless, but mastering it, he got to his feet and hammered on the glass of the window to the consternation of his colleagues. "Stop!" he called despairingly. "Stop him!" Too late. The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the Rheinwagen left the line with smoking tires and rocketed away in one terrific, sustained burst of acceleration. Mr. Nelson knew then that what he was about to hear through the headphones would not be the familiar voice of Arthur Day. He was right. People started to run, and the ambulance dashed up the course. Mercifully, perhaps, Mr. Nelson did not see them. He had fainted. The tragic duel between Volanti and von Eberstraum was almost the sole topic of conversation in motor racing circles for months afterwards. As usual, theories as to the cause of the disaster were legion. On only one point were the theorists unanimous. The new corner was, in some obscure way, highly dangerous. First, Volanti had approached the corner at a fantastic speed, crammed on his brakes, and got into a terrifying and inexplicable slide as though the road had suddenly become a sheet of ice. To the horrified spectators it looked as though a crash was inevitable, and only Volanti's uncanny skill and presence of mind can have saved him. The little man's elbows worked like flails as he fought for control, Instead of the head-on impact, which seemed so inevitable, the Maserati caught the bank a glancing blow as the tail swung wide, then rocketed across to the inside, as though it must surely plunge over the bank to disaster, but was corrected and held on the very brink, all in a moment of time. Finally, before the astounded spectators had time to draw breath, the car was on the road again. The howl of the blower burst forth once more like a triumphant cry, and Volanti was gone in a flurry of turf, dust and smoke to set up his incredible record. A marshal walked up and examined the road surface, suspecting oil, but there was none visible. Many spectators were then driven away from the corner by an appalling stench, which suddenly arose. Others, oddly enough, failed to notice it. Then came von Eberstraum. The Rheinwagen appeared to be travelling equally rapidly, but seemed quite steady under the terrific braking, and was taking the corner very fast, but apparently under perfect control, when once more the inexplicable happened. In the middle of the corner, von Eberstraum braked suddenly and appeared to alter course, with the result that the car went completely out of control, spun round and disappeared backward over the bank on the inside. There was a sickening crashing and splintering as the car bounded over and over through the undergrowth until it eventually came to rest, a mangled wreck, against a great upright block of stone. The most popular theory of the accident was that the brakes seized, the armchair theorist talking glibly of the fluid boiling in the brake pipes as the result of the heavy braking immediately before the corner. They ignored the fact that the braking system fitted to the car had undergone many far more grueling tests in Grand Prix races. There were other witnesses of the disaster who had their own shadowy inkling of the possible cause, but preferred to keep it to themselves because they doubted the evidence of their eyes, having seen what many had apparently failed to see. As von Eberstraum came into the corner, they'd fancied that something darted out from the shadow of the bank below them into the path of the car. It was only a fleeting glimpse, seen out of the corners of eyes intently focused on the car alone. After the car had gone, the road was deserted. Peter Bligh was amongst those who had vague but disturbing ideas about the accident, which he decided to keep to himself. Mr. Nelson was the only person who was not in the slightest doubt as to the cause, although he too preferred to keep his own counsel. His first action, after his recovery from a severe nervous breakdown, was to order a high and unclimbable fence to be erected all around the new corner. Some of you may have wondered, like I did, why such a promising and costly improvement of Longberry Hill should be allowed to fall into disuse so long. I have at last managed to get the real facts from Mr. Nelson and Peter Bligh. So now you know, and may draw your own conclusions. Personally, I agree with Mr. Nelson. I think there's something on the inside of that fence that is best left alone.